Good evening. I would like to call the business meeting of the Portland Board of Public Education to order. It is Tuesday, December 19th, 2017, and the Portland Board of Public Education is meeting at City Hall and Council Chambers. May I please ask the superintendent to call the roll?
Yes, Madam Chair. Mr. Balfonts?
Here.
Ms. Seeliger? Ms. Vendel? Ms. Davis?
Here.
Ms. Thompson?
Here.
Ms. Morioni?
Here.
Mr. Atkinson?
Here.
Mr. Rodriguez?
Presente.
Ms. Clater? Ms. Farah? Ms. Yuri?
Here.
And Chair Tavaro.
Here. And Ms. Seeliger and Ms. Vendel both did let me know that they are both under the weather. It seems there's a flu going around. Would everyone please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
For the report of the chair this evening, I just wanted to list for the viewing public the appointments that I have made over the last week. I did appoint members to our various committees. On Finance Committee, that is going to be chaired this year by member Jenna Vendel, and the members will be Lori Davis, Roberto Rodriguez, and Mark Balfonts. Curriculum will be chaired by Marnie Morioni, and members will be Tim Atkinson and Mark Balfonts. Operations will be chaired by Roberto Rodriguez, and members will be Sarah Thompson and Lori Davis. Policy and Public Affairs will be chaired by Holly Seeliger, and members will be Tim Atkinson and Marnie Morioni. On the Appointments Committee will be chaired by Sarah Thompson, and members will be Marnie Morioni and Mark Balfonts. I do note that the students haven't yet been appointed. They are in the process of filling out their committee preference surveys for me, and so we will be meeting tomorrow for their orientation along with their mentors who have also been appointed. Ms. Morioni has been appointed to mentor Sahar LaFera. Jenna Vendel has been appointed to mentor Tiana Yuri, and Roberto Rodriguez has been appointed to mentor Isabel Clater. So we will have their appointments to committees ready for you. The staff assigned to each of your committees will be reaching out to you if they haven't already to schedule meetings for January, and students will be appointed in time to join you for those first meetings. And that concludes the report of the chair this evening. Moving into report of the students, we have Casco Bay High School. Ms. Yuri.
Thank you. My name is Tiana Yuri, and I will begin my address by wishing everybody a very happy winter season. So even on the brink of Christmas break, or winter vacation, Casco Bay is hard at work. Our freshmen just culminated their first expedition, Building Community, which our students presented at City Hall last Thursday, proposing their best ideas on ways to better our city based on the comprehensive plan. From housing to energy use, we were proud to present our learning to city leaders and share our vision. We are also impressed by the freshman class's work, and I'm so glad to recognize them today. After break, our sophomores will begin their expedition, Arc Towards Justice, exploring racial inequality in the United States. To kick off this expedition, we will host a community dialogue on bias reduction from 8 to 2:30 at Casco Bay High. And it will be a powerful experience where we will develop common understanding and move to action steps to implement in our community. This dialogue will involve all sophomores, and we invite community leaders and members, so if anyone is interested, please let me know. The junior class is currently in the midst of Casco Bay's most rigorous expedition, Public Policy. This year is titled Towards a More Perfect Union. We focus on issues that divide our nation, enter an intensive research process, and craft public policy proposals encapsulated in our white papers. The expedition will culminate with our Public Policy Symposium on February 12th through 13th. At the library, we will share our presentations describing the issue and our proposals in front of experts. Mine is Wall Street reform, so maybe check in. Junior career explorations will begin the following week, which we're very excited for. And last Friday, we celebrated our March to the Post Office, celebrating every senior's completion of a college application. And we're all incredibly proud of them for modeling excellence in our community every day. So seniors are also beginning their senior exhibition, which we describe as the intersection between a personal passion and the need in the world. From political polarization to eating disorders, our seniors are really investigating the issues that matter. And so our intensives are coming up. So for those of you who don't know, this is the Casco Bay version of electives, where we immerse ourselves in one topic for an entire week, from snowshoeing to songwriting or from gerrymandering to investigative journalism. Intensives are an integral part of the Casco Bay experience. And finally, our musical, The Addams Family, goes up on January 26th or 27th at Portland High, and we invite you for a fun and spooky time. So thank you so much, and that concludes my address.
Thank you, Ms. Uri. Report of the superintendent.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Tonight, we'd like to start by honoring Casco Bay High School math teacher Priya Natarajan, who is a state finalist in the 2017 Presidential Awards for Excellence in Mathematics and Science Teaching. Priya Natarajan is one of just 2 math teachers in the state of Maine who are state-level finalists for the 7th through 12th grade teachers of mathematics in the Presidential Awards for Excellence teaching program. Priya and other state finalists are being honored at a state ceremony later this year and will have a chance to become presidential awardees at the national level, potentially winning $10,000 from the National Science Foundation. Casco Bay Principal Derek Pierce recommended Priya for the award. He said, and I quote, "Priya does not just fulfill the rigorous criteria for this national honor, she exemplifies it. Most every student and educator I know would like to be much more like Priya." Priya was a math teacher and department head at Deering High School for 12 years before coming to Casco Bay 3 years ago. Prior to that, she was a founding teacher at Boston Arts Academy. She has a bachelor's degree from Ohio State University and a master's degree from Harvard. Principal Pierce added that, quote, "Her humble but persistent advocacy has elevated the status of math at our school, whether it's through PICU or a new intensive in sabermetrics. Priya is especially passionate and effective at inspiring young women and students of color to pursue STEM. Students know Ms. Natarajan will support them with a generous heart and a clear and flexible instruction. Priya is prized as a colleague because she's as hardworking as she is brilliant, as fun to be around as she is impeccably reliable and ethical," end quote. When I visited Portland shortly before becoming superintendent, Casco Bay was the last school on my tour. I arrived minutes before dismissal, and after dismissal, as I walked around with Principal Pierce, I met Priya. This, I remind everybody, was the last day of school. And there she was in the library with a couple of students, tutoring them as they finished their assignments that they needed to do to complete their credits. All of our teachers work exceptionally hard, but I knew then that Priya was special. Thank you, Priya, for all that you do to help our students love math as much as you do, especially one David Boltana, who is very much looking forward to taking calculus with you this coming semester. And congratulations on this most deserved recognition. I would like to report that the Maine Department of Education just completed site visits at Portland High School and the Paths Casco Bay High School complex as part of their evaluation of projects under the Major School Construction Program. We were among the last of the approximately 80 schools that are being considered for state capital investments. We will learn in the late spring or early summer where we are placed on the preliminary construction lineup. There will be an appeals process following that, and the final construction order will be finalized sometime during the summer of 2018. We are hopeful that the DOE team will see the large level of needs in these two high school buildings. Just to remind everyone and members of the public, our Sebago Technic's Comprehensive Facilities Assessment last year concluded that each of these buildings will have over $40 million in expected facilities needs. Not just, that's just for facilities needs. That does not include the shortcomings for educational purposes in those buildings over the next 20 years. I would like to thank our Facilities Director, Steve Stilfen, and Doug Sherwood for organizing these visits. I also would like to thank the principals, Sheila Jepson at Portland High, and Kevin Stilfen and Derek Pierce at Paths Casco Bay for their work to highlight the educational shortcomings of the building and outline a vision for what would be achieved with the new state-of-the-art building. As they concluded their visits today, the state team was especially complimentary of our principals for being able to articulate the shortcomings of the building and also make it very clear what the possibilities would be with state funding for those buildings. So I'm very hopeful. Obviously, we also heard during the visits that there's tremendous amount of need throughout the state, so that none of it is guaranteed, but I think we did a very good job of, quote unquote, putting our worst foot forward as they visited us. I also want to update you on the regionalization effort that I've previewed at our last couple of meetings. Last Friday, we, along with our partner districts in South Portland and Westbrook, received feedback from the DOE on our Phase 1 application for a regional service center. Our proposal, which we had submitted the previous week, was approved by DOE for continued discussion and for submission of a Part 2 application in mid-April should we decide to proceed. As you know, there are significant disincentives to not applying, so we will continue to work as a team to determine if there are programmatic benefits that can result from this effort to go along with preventing the loss of central administration funding that would accompany our not submitting a proposal. I would, however, be remiss if I did not point out that while we are proceeding with our planning efforts, I support the position taken by the Maine School Superintendents Associations that the legislature should require a moratorium on the implementation of this policy until there is necessary time to complete thoughtful and careful planning. For example, the DOE's response to us suggested that since there are several other partnerships that are forming in Cumberland County, and all of Cumberland County is considered a region by the Department of Education, and since those partnerships involve some of the districts that we're currently working with, that we ought to explore a more comprehensive and broad-reaching partnership that involves all of the districts that are interested in forming regional centers. So clearly that makes sense, and it's something that we would be happy to consider, but it's not doable to bring all of the parties and the governing boards and make all of those decisions under the timelines that are currently in place, and I think that's why the MSMA recommendation for a moratorium makes a lot of sense. So in closing, this is our last board meeting in 2017, and as we head into the winter break, I would like to wish everyone a restful and peaceful break. I look forward to the start of another promising Portland Public Schools year when we are back together on January 2nd. I would also like to wish a happy holiday season to those in our school community who celebrate Kwanzaa, Christmas, and Hanukkah, and to all a happy new year, and enjoy the break.
Thank you. Report of the Secretary. Consideration and action to approve the meeting minutes of December 4th, 2017. Is there a motion? Ms. Morioni, seconded by Mr. Atkinson. Are there any questions on the motion? Seeing none, is there any public comment on the motion? Seeing none, any discussion on the motion? And seeing none, all those in favor of approving the meeting minutes of December 4th, 2017, please indicate. It's unanimous with the students voting in the affirmative. Report of committees. The committees haven't met yet. They'll begin meeting in January, and we will have reports beginning again on January 16th. Moving into consent items. Would the superintendent please read the items into consent?
Yes. Before we do that, I believe that we had minutes for both the 4th and the 5th, so we probably need a motion to approve the minutes for the 5th.
For the 5th. Is there a motion to approve the, Ms. Morioni, seconded by Mr. Rodriguez? Are there any questions on the meeting minutes for the 5th? Seeing none, is there any public comment on the meeting minutes for the 5th? Seeing none, any board discussion? And seeing none, I will call for a vote. All those in favor of approving the meeting minutes for the 5th, please indicate. It's unanimous with the students voting in the affirmative. And now we can move into consent items.
Yes. Lincoln Middle School received art supplies from Corning Townsend of Edgecombe. The district received winter clothing items from employees of Kindred at Home of Portland. East End Elementary School received manicures for their Grammys from Akari of Portland. Thank you. And Paths received the following donations: materials for their woodworking program from eReplacementandParts.com of Midvale, Utah, a stack-on extra-wide electronic safe for the media program from Jay Barker of Portland, and a cash donation to use towards the purchase of a welding camera for the welding program from Casco Bay Steel Structures, Inc. of South Portland. And finally, Reiki Elementary School received a Hannaford gift card for Thanksgiving meal for a family from Lucy Stover of Boston Scientific in Buxton. So thank you very much to all of those generous contributors to the Portland Public Schools.
Thank you. Under old business, we have consideration and action to accept the referendum results as certified by the city clerk of the referendum on question 3 held on November 7th, 2017, approving City Council Order 155-16/17, adopted by the City Council on April 24th, 2017, Order 155-1617, approving Longfellow, Lizeth Przumskot, and Reiki Elementary School renovation projects with total project costs not to exceed $64,260,000 and authorizing general obligation bonds. As a result of the passage of this referendum, the Board of Education will begin the planning and execution of the school renovations described within the City Council Order 155-1617 as attached. Ms. Thompson has made the motion. Is there a second? Mr. Atkinson. Would the superintendent like to speak to the motion?
Yes, Madam Chair. Recently, as everybody knows, city voters approved the $64,260,000 referendum to rebuild Longfellow, Lyseth, Przumskot, and Reiki elementary schools. The last time the board acted on any aspect of this project was in January of 2017. At that time, the board formally moved to accept and refer a $61 million proposal that had been approved by the Joint Council and Board Subcommittee on January 31st, 2017 for rebuilding the same 4 schools. Upon referral, that proposal, finalized by the council, increased to the $64 million amount, and the council's action also added an alternate $32 million two-school option. The board never acted to accept either of those modifications pending the will of the voters, and now that the referendum is complete, Board Council has advised this action is needed to proceed with design and construction based on the $64,260,000 amount.
Are there any questions on the motion? Ms. Morioni.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a clarification in the language in the packet. It says, right after the cost, $17,998,000, it says, it should be noted that the allocation for each school is an estimate, and that the finance director will have the flexibility to adjust amounts between schools as long as the total bond is not exceeded. So I just want to get some clarification around finance director, as in the finance director of the city, or who is that referring to, and a little bit more information around why,
That is the finance director of the city.
and a little more information as to why that person would have the flexibility to adjust the amounts, and would it go through a process?
I believe, and Alicia, you can help me with this, I believe that this is giving them the bonding, giving the city budget director the bonding authority, and as part of the bonding authority, making those adjustments. I think that's always a hot mic, from what I've been told.
Very complicated. Yes, so this essentially is talking about bonding only, and it gives him the ability to adjust the timing and the amounts between the schools as they're read there. So if we needed to shift some funds from one to the other, he has the ability to do that and to decide when to go out to bond for those items.
And that was specific language that was included in the order that the city council approved, and that was what was brought to the voters, and, very much that intact language. I believe that specific language was in the action that the voters were asked to consider.
Okay, so this was exact.
It
This
is,
was
and
not
and
added.
and it's normal in the finance director's authority per charter, that gives him that ability. It's not anything
And just
extraordinary.
to determine the bonding of...
Yes.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Ms. Thompson?
I had one more question, Alicia, to the superintendent. So the total bond not to exceed, is this going to be based upon the architectural work that says, so if it's, one's gone up, one's gone down, so on and so forth, and the shifting of that?
Yes.
That's based upon the work that we say we're going to do?
Yes.
And the amounts that may have changed?
Correct.
It's not to say, I've decided this year we're not going to go out to bond. It's going to keep the process moving. It doesn't hold anything up. Is that correct?
No, and I did speak with Brendan today, and he confirmed that they'll bond in the manner that we need the funds, in the manner that the committee determines.
Okay.
So that's not going to be held up, and this is really, you're right, to reallocate funds if needed. If, one project ends up being higher and one's lower, it doesn't hold us to the amounts that were just read in the order.
Okay, thank you very much.
Ms. Morioni?
All right, Alicia, can you...
Just that.
On the finance side, though, can you just walk us through, so we have our committee, it goes to the board for final vote on the dollar amount. Does it then go to the city council for any approval, or does it go, you then tell Brendan, okay, we need this amount now bonded? I mean, how's the
So it doesn't. The
collaboration?
city council, and this obviously needs to be vetted through legal, I am not the final authority by any means, but essentially the city's already given their approval for the total amount, so it
Right.
really is up to Brendan, once we determine an order of projects, the drawdowns from the construction loans and things like that, for us to go back and say, okay, this is the amount of money we think we'll need, and this is when we need it, and then they can determine, do they want to borrow that all at once? Do they want to do that in increments? And that'll be really up to them to decide their total indebtedness and that kind of thing. So as long as we have the funds that are available to us, it really doesn't matter to us when they do the borrowing, as long as we have funds that we need. So they'll structure that as they need to structure it, but assuring that we have the funds that we need at the same time.
Great. And just as long as it's clear, transparent to the public, okay, now they've asked for additional funds, this is how it's being done through Brendan?
Right,
and-
so essentially what will happen is we'll make a plan well ahead of time, and that amount will show up in our budget on an annual basis as the amount that we've borrowed for that year. So
Okay.
it'll be something that'll be very clear to everyone.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? Seeing none, is there any public comment on this item? Seeing none, any board discussion? Seeing none, I will call for a vote. All those in favor of accepting the referendum results as certified by the city clerk of the referendum question 3 held on November 7th, 2017, approving City Council Order 155-1617, adopted by the City Council on April 24th, 2017, Order 155-1617, approving Longfellow, Lizeth, Presumpscot, and Reiki Elementary School renovation projects with total project costs not to exceed $64,260,000 and authorizing general obligation bonds. As a result of passage of this referendum, the Board of Education will begin planning and execution of the school renovations described within the City Council Order 155-1617 as attached. All those in favor, please indicate. It's unanimous with the students voting in the affirmative. That's it for old business. Moving on to new business, we have consideration and action to approve a contract agreement between the Portland Board of Public Education and the Benefit Association of School Employees, BASE, July 1, 2017 to June 30th, 2020. Is there a motion? Ms. Thompson, seconded by Ms. Davis. Would the superintendent like to speak to the motion?
Yes, Madam Chair. The board and district administrative team have worked collaboratively with the BASE negotiations team since May of 2017 and are bringing forward the final contract for full board approval. BASE membership ratified this contract this past Sunday, December 17th, 2017. This contract provides, among other things, a 1% cost of living adjustment in the first year, along with a step increase for eligible students and similar arrangements in subsequent years. It also provides specific market-based adjustments for our transportation and custodial staff in years 2 and 3 respectively. We believe these adjustments will make Portland Public Schools more competitive in these hard-to-staff areas. I'm grateful to the BASE leadership for their willingness to think creatively about these staffing challenges. I also wanted to point out that Liz Bryan, who is the president of BASE, could not be here today because of family commitment, but she did ask me to read a statement to the board and the public regarding their take on negotiations. Liz writes, "I would like to thank the central office, school board representation at the negotiations, Jeannie Crocker, Barb Stoddard, Richard Moore, and school board member Roberto Rodriguez and attorney Campbell Badger. I would also like to thank you for your input given to us via Campbell. Besides me, my team of representatives were Gregory Basier, Nick D'Orazio, Andrea Garland, Deb Kiersted, Ellen LaChapelle, and David Morrell, as well as spokesperson Becky Fernald, who's the MEA UNISERV director. Though not a unanimous vote, it did pass for ratifications, and the members were also appreciative of what they did receive and what they did not lose. Thanks, and share my appreciation with the school board."
Are there any questions? Seeing none, is there any public comment? Seeing none, is there any board discussion on this motion? Seeing none, I would call for a vote. All those in favor of approving the contract agreement between the Portland Board of Public Education and the Benefit Association of School Employees, BASE, July 1, 2017 to June 30, 2020, please indicate. It's unanimous with the students voting in the affirmative. Consideration and action to create an advisory building committee as a standing board committee consistent with the superintendent's recommendations. Is there a motion? Mr. Rodriguez, seconded by Ms. Morioni. And would the superintendent like to speak to this motion?
Yes. And I'm going to go to the front because we have a PowerPoint that illustrates this. So, as you know, this is a revised governance proposal from what we discussed at the workshop a couple weeks ago. This proposal attempts to incorporate multiple perspectives that were offered, including ensuring a broader level of community engagement while retaining the efficiencies of a smaller building committee, recognizing staff's need to have a clear line of decision-making while ensuring continuity, while also recognizing board member interest and expertise, and preserving Portland's unique commitment to collaborative building projects with the city and the school district. Staff's revised proposal calls for the establishment of a school building committee that is separate from the board's operation committee. So that's a significant difference. The committee's composition would be consistent with my original recommendations. As such, it would be made up of 3 board members, 2 city councilors appointed by the Board of Education upon recommendation of the city council, and 4 members of the general public, 1 associated with each school project, that would be appointed by the board based on a school board appointments committee recommendation. School board membership in this committee would be for the length of the committee member's tenure on the board. So if a board member retires, resigns, or is not elected, the board chair would appoint a replacement. The committee would be co-chaired by one of the members of the school board, who would be selected by the board chair from among the sitting board representatives on the building committee, and would be co-chaired by a member of the council selected by the board chair. The members of the public would be expected to continue to serve on the committee for as long as they remained a resident of Portland. Any vacancies among members of the public would be filled by the school board based on a recommendation from the board's appointment committee. Additionally, and this is in response to the suggestions that were provided, and this is the last bullet here, we are recommending the development of the institution of a school-based advisory panel for each school building project. The advisory panel would be a sounding board and a communications vehicle for the building committee while the actual planning and construction of each school project was underway. These groups would be chaired by the public representative on the larger building committee and the school board representative for that school's geographic district. Each advisory group would have up to 13 representatives selected by the chair from recommendations by the school principal, and would include at least 7 school employees, and the remaining 6 members would be members of the school community, including parents and others, and other interested members of the public, and elected city officials. The advisory group would advise the larger board on specific design elements for each project and how best to communicate about the project with staff, families, and other stakeholders. The advisory groups would cease to exist upon completion of that particular school's rebuild. Member Thompson asked that we try to lay out a timeline for how these particular sort of beginning steps would take place, and so this timeline aims to represent that. So assuming that we have a board action today, we would go forward with the identification of board representatives, which I believe that Chair Terraro has already identified. Then we would identify council representatives, and that would be between now and the second meeting in January, the January 18th. The goal is to be able to appoint the building committee at that meeting. We would, as a result of the actions that you would be taking today, call for interested parties that would serve as community representatives. So we have an application form that we would publish on our website tomorrow for interested individuals who want to be a part of the the larger building, not the larger, the advisory panels, but the standing building committee, so people that would be able to apply. Those applications would be due by January 5th. And then between January 5th and the meeting on the 18th, the community applicants would be vetted by the board's appointments committee, and the appointments committee would come forward to the board with a slate of committee members. By the time that the packets go out on January 16th for consideration by the board at the meeting. Actually, I'm sorry, the meeting is on the 16th, so it would be, the consideration would be done ahead of that, so probably, I think, the 13th would be the, or 12th probably, would be the date that the packet would go out. And so between the 5th and the 12th, the appointments committee would review and come up with a slate of candidates for board consideration on the 18th. So just to quickly be clear about the decision makers around some of these key decisions, in terms of the establishment of the building committee, that is a full board action. The identification of city councilors is ultimately a board action with the input of the council. Identification of community representatives, it's the board's appointments committee identifies them, and obviously the board establishes the advisory building committee, so those are recommendations to the board. The building committee meeting, the building committee members would be the full board, and the co-chairs of the building committee would be determined by the board chair. So that's where we are. This is our revised recommendation, and so we're open to questions and discussion.
Questions? Ms. Thompson.
Hate this to all be all about me, but, so I looked at your timeline, and Ms. Morioni and I, I chair the appointments committee, and Ms. Morioni is a member, along with Mr. Balfons. Neither one of us are going to be here that week. We'll both be traveling. So we may need to do a little adjustment maybe on that one, if we can be a little flexible on that date. That would be great. Thank you.
Ms. Davis.
That kind of keys in with me, because as I was listening to that timeline, it felt a little tight over the holidays to really do the kind of getting the word out to the public. I think one of the things that I think is important and is still a little fuzzy in here is that these are building projects that are being financed and done by the entire city. And it reads a bit as though in order to participate on the building committee and possibly on the advisory committees, you actually have to live in a specific area or are a parent in the schools. Those are really minorities of the people who will be paying the bills. And I think it's important that if we want to really ground our school activities and our educational efforts in the entire community, that we make it very clear to all of the community, people like myself who no longer have children in schools, people who may live in an area that is not anywhere near one of the buildings that we're redoing, that they are welcome, they are encouraged, and should, if they wish to participate, put their name forward, because this is a community effort. This is not just an effort by a small minority segment of our population. And I think where it's asking for thousands of dollars from taxpayers, I'm one of those, $225,000 valuation pieces. You're going to ask for $2,700 of my tax money. I should feel welcome to at least put my name forward as a member of the public to serve and to have input into the process. So I think we need to be very careful that we word this to make it clear that our building process welcomes all residents of Portland who wish to put their name forward for consideration, and that we need to be mindful as a board that we want all Portlanders, all taxpayers to feel like they are welcome and have a voice here, that this is not just a small group who are driving this. Only parents are welcome, or only people who live in the Longfellow neighborhood are welcome. That no, all Portlanders are welcome to participate in this. This is a community effort. So that's something where I think needs to get clearer in this, and I think also having some more time to really explain that to the public is good, because too often our schools are seen as, it's like, I wouldn't run for school board, I don't have any kids in the school. I don't know how many doors I've knocked on, and people say, I don't have kids in the school, this doesn't involve me. No, it does. Education is one of the critical things that our community does, and this is a critical and significant investment in our educational infrastructure, and so it's an opportunity for us to engage the public widely, because they are engaged in this widely. Every single taxpayer is going to pay this bill. The other question that I have is, and I got a little lost about who's advising whom and where the decision-making actually resides. So with the advisory building committee, do they have the ability to make any decisions, or are they simply advising the board?
They are advising the board.
Okay, so they can't, if a decision needs to get made, they need to bring it back to the board for a decision.
I think that's correct in terms of what the actual governance of the project is. I think
Okay.
that, ultimately, and I sort of reiterated this at our last meeting, ultimately, the board is accountable for the resolution of this. I do not believe that the board can abdicate that responsibility to
Delegate
the building committee, delegate that to the building committee. So I think the level of oversight and sort of second guessing will be up to the board to determine, but ultimately, any key decision, contracting, other things along those lines have to be made by the board.
Okay, you used the word key decision. So I think one of the things, thinking ahead, how do we define, are there minor decisions that this group can make, or are they simply advisory to the board on all decisions? Because getting that straightened out in our minds before we get into the decisions would be helpful, because it would lay the groundwork for the decisions that will need to get made.
And I shouldn't use key in that.
Okay.
So it's an advisory building committee, so it does not make those
It has no
decisions.
authority.
That's right.
Okay. And the advisory groups are advisory to the building committee or to the board?
To the building
To the
committee.
building committee. So it's like it's a hierarchical structure that we're creating.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think the way that we're thinking about it, that's more of a device for inclusiveness, an opportunity for people to know, a larger number of people that are specifically attached to that building project, to know what is happening with the project and have an opportunity to provide feedback, as well as communicate, to neighbors and others and, key organizations, other staff, and so on.
No, I think that makes sense. We used that with the hall building committee. There were times the playground group included a lot of other people who weren't on, included people who weren't on the building committee itself, but it was who were interested in that area. Okay.
Can I just go back to your original point? Because I do want to be clear that the recommendation that we brought forward is not for at-large representatives of the community. Our recommendation is for individuals representing that particular, one for each of the school projects, but it is not that they have to be parents or that they have to be, sort of linked to the school in any way other than living within that boundary. So that's slightly different from what you suggested, which I heard was more of an at-large representatives from the community.
It is, and will be important for me in terms of garnering my support, and I would move to amend this to take that limitation off. We've asked all taxpayers in Portland to support this, and I think to then limit people's participation sends the wrong message to the people who have voted to support this, and to the people who did not vote to support it, but who will still pay. And so I think that to limit who can have input at the outset is probably, it's not a way I would like to put this forward to the public. I don't think it sends the right message.
And I will just point out that from, the staff's perspective in putting together this recommendation, that role was being met by having elected officials that would be at large, would not necessarily be linked. It's not, our recommendation wasn't to have the representatives for Longfellow and Brezomscott and so on. It was to have whoever the board appointed, so those would be at large. And likewise for the council members, there's no restrictions on that membership other than what the council decides and the board approves. So that's where we were getting to that at large. I'm not arguing. I think that you're offering an amendment, and I just want to be clear that everybody understands that that's an amendment to what we originally.
That would provide a different level of representation to some members of the public versus others. If you didn't live in one of the 3 designated geographic school areas, you do not have the ability to put your name forward. And so I think it is a 2-tiered and not equal system.
Ms. Thompson, and just reminding folks that we're still on questions.
Right. So, I didn't, I closed up too quick when I was, so my question, and it was similar to what Ms. Davis was talking about a little bit, in that, my question is, so you have 4 members of the general public, 1 associated with each school project, and then we have the 13 representatives selected by the chairs from recommendations by the school principal. And I'm wondering, for food for thought, because we're going to put out the request, hopefully far and wide. If they don't make it to the 4, then potentially they could be on the 13. And I'm wondering if we're putting it out to the city, that there'll be a lot of interested people that come forward and have qualifications one way or the other, and they may not be connected to a school. So I'm wondering, opposed to having the chairs of these advisory groups and the principal choose the people, that it's done from the pool of applicants that we get from the get-go, because that's going to be plentiful without then having each of the advisory committee chairs to then pick people, because I have a feeling, to Ms. Davis's point, that there's going to be a lot of interest in this. And so 4 is a very limited number, and the broader, I think, engagement is going to come from your proposal here on the advisory group. So I'm wondering what your thoughts might be on that, Superintendent. And then in the past, when we've done superintendent searches, we put it out to the public and we had them answer questions why and what do you bring to the table. And then we were able to evaluate the appointments based upon criteria that way. And so my question, in addition to what I just asked about the makeup, changing that language a little bit so we can be more broad, but also the outreach, interest in being considered. I think we need to really reach far and wide. We had it in the paper before, and we had it, in here, there, and everywhere, and they had to answer questions of why they're interested, not just putting their name forward, but what do they bring. So I'm wondering what your thinking is about that.
So we do have that in the application. Anything that you bring to the project that would, why are you interested? So I think that is a part of that. I'm not 100% sure that I understand your first question, so I just want to make sure.
So my question is, so if we were, more than likely, we'll get a plentiful applicant pool when we put that application out, which I would love to see. But once we put that out, I think we're going to have plenty of people, so we won't need this step where it says have up to 13 representatives selected by the chairs from recommendations by the school principal, because there are people that are going to come forward in that pool that the principal won't know, and that chair of that committee may not know, but brings a plethora of expertise to it, and they may not live in that area. So I think if we're going to limit this 4 to those schools, then the 13 should be broad, and not only to include that population at that school, but anybody and everybody, again, chosen from those that applied and made their stance of why they want to be there. Because I think that it's going to be hard enough to choose the 4, but then if we have qualified applicants for the 13, it keeps the inclusiveness moving. So I guess I would like us to consider that way of going about it, because to Ms. Davis's point, I don't think that we'll have a shortage, and there are a lot of people that the principal don't know, and that really want to be involved. So I also am curious, because you have here, Javier, that they would be chaired by the board members, and there's actually one of these schools that is, 2 of them are in D5.
I know that. So
I'm wondering,
co-chaired.
because there are some at-large members potentially that may want to also do that, maybe we could consider somebody from an at-large position to chair one of those, since D5 has 2 schools. So just, again, food for thought.
Again, I think we've thought through some of these aspects. I think if you want to make recommendations that you can all agree on about alterations to those recommendations, we'll be happy to take those under consideration.
Okay.
But I think that we wanted to put something in front of you that you could then debate and reach an agreement on today, so that we can begin this process. So I don't have a strong commitment to the 13 people have to be people that reside in the school, in the same way that I don't have a strong commitment to the 4 people that are on the committee have to be representatives from each of those schools, nor do I have a strong commitment to the chair of the advisory panels has to be that person. It's a straw man. It's something for you to discuss, make recommendations, debate, and in the end, have agreement around, so that we can move forward and begin the process of building the schools.
So we would probably need to come to agreement tonight, because that's what we're voting on here, so.
That's right.
I guess when it comes time, I guess I'll do a couple of amendments and go from there, if that's appropriate.
Yep.
Thank you.
I believe that's appropriate.
Mr. Rodriguez.
Thank you, Chair. Javier, do you mind that last sentence, the last point that you just made, do you mind adding or explaining, out of the temporary advisory committees, that you're proposing 7 school employees be part of that? Obviously, we have employees in our schools that don't reside in Portland, so would their residency in Portland be a requirement?
No, it would not.
Okay,
They would
so
be that
simply
their staff in the buildings, and the interest there is to have people that are going to actually have to work and live in that building to have, significant input into the process.
Thank you. Just wanted to clarify.
Any other questions?
Yeah, just one question. Given the timeline that this stuff is coming together in about a month, I'm wondering if, in the meantime, there's any work that we can do on some of the more pressing issues, if there's any plan to include any agenda items before the advisory committee is fully formed.
Not at this time, no. We don't have. I mean, we are working on specific things. We're developing the RFP. We have somebody that is coming on board to help us with that process as a consultant, to help to get that RFP crafted, but that's something that's going to take some time. As you may recall from the timeline presentation at the last meeting, that's something that we're looking at, I believe, in an April timeframe. So I think the April timeframe for that is what we're working towards, but we obviously have to get the ball rolling on that. And then I think there are decisions around specific things that get included or don't get included in that RFP, such as fair contracting provisions, the sequencing of projects, things along those lines. Those are decisions that ultimately have to be made by the board, and so the sooner we can actually get a governance structure that we are comfortable with bringing some thinking to and then bringing that to the board is, that's why we're trying to press forward with that today.
Thank you.
Ms. Thompson.
Okay, sorry, one more question. Since you're not opposed to the numbers and all this fun stuff, to Ms. Davis's point, so we have 4 members of the general public, 1 associated with each school project. I'm wondering, the at-large aspect, if we shouldn't add 2 more people, so have 4 for one each of the schools and 2 at-large members of the public, so that way you're not limited to just the 4 in those schools. So it would be actually 6 members of the general public, the 4 are falling within, and then just 2 members at large. I'm wondering if what people think about that.
Ms. Davis.
My thinking would be that geography is not the most important thing that someone would bring to the building committee. I think, thinking about expertise, interest, commitment, we're asking a huge commitment from public members in terms of sort of staying with this over a long period of time, that I would be more interested in selecting for their interest in doing this work and their expertise for doing this work, the things that they would bring to the table that might, be things that we on the board don't have or would augment our capacity to understand what we're undertaking, would be more important than their geographic location. That's, I wouldn't want to limit it. I would say you just have members of the public and not get into needing to find somebody who lives somewhere, because that's not going to help us move. That's not a key thing for successfully renovating buildings, is where you live is not the determining factor for me. So that would be my thinking. And I am concerned, going way back to our discussion, not way back, but going back to our earlier discussion about this getting too big and getting too many people, not in the sense of too many people, because I'm somebody who thinks the more minds at the problem and the puzzle, the better. But I'm concerned about having it be agile enough to be able to respond. So that would be my concern with adding 2 more people at this point in the advisory group. So I just take the requirement of locality, local, where you live is not the important piece. It's what you bring to the building committee, and that frees you up, because you might have 2 really great people from one area and nobody from another, nobody from the Lyseth area who's interested or has particular expertise. So it would give your appointments committee more flexibility on who you can bring to us.
I guess I would ask the chair if we could have just some sort of dialogue amongst the other members, other than Ms. Davis and myself, too, that about what their thoughts are about the number and about the point of at-large versus within the school project. If we could just get some feedback, because I want to make some motions here, but if there's not support, for that kind of dynamic, I'm going to make a different one, so.
Madam Chair, do you want to ask if the students have any questions before we move to discussion?
Yeah, so I would like to just wrap up questions first, and then we can get into debate after public comment. And that's the appropriate time to have that back and forth. So do the students have any questions? No, okay. So then if we're good on questions, we'll do public comment, and then we'll get into debate. I'm going to go back up there. Okay, so at this time, we would take public comment on the motion.
Hi, I'm Emily Figdor, live on 31 Cushman Street. I'm the director of Protect Our Neighborhood Schools and the co-chair of the Reiki PTO. Thanks for the opportunity to share our views tonight. I appreciate the direction that this committee, the freestanding building committee, is taking, but remain very concerned about the public not having a robust role in the building committee. I think having 4 members is, compared to 10 members of the public on the hall building committee, is really severely limiting the opportunity of the public to participate. There are many people in our communities that have a lot to offer, different expertise, experience, perspectives, and just limiting it to 4 people, I think, is going to result in weaker school projects. And then the idea that Ms. Davis is suggesting that those 4 people might not have any connection to the actual school communities very much concerns me, that the committee could go forward without any anchor to the actual community in which a school is being renovated. I think it would raise a lot of concerns within that school community that they don't have they don't have representation on the building committee. We need to ensure that that the building committee is making decisions based on what's wanted and needed in those schools and in the broader community, and it's very hard to do that if you don't have someone from the community represented on the building committee. So I would encourage you to expand the number of representatives of the public that are able to participate as full members of the building committee, and really hope that you'll accept a more robust role for the public. The public has been critical in getting us to this point because there was such a desire to see this project move forward, and we shouldn't at this point minimize the role and prevent people from being involved and when they want to be and have a lot to offer. As multiple members have recognized, there's likely going to be a lot of applicants for this. With more minds, I think you'll see stronger projects in the end. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other members of the public? Seeing none, I would close public comment. So at this time, just based on our questions, I'm hearing 3, possibly 4 amendments. What I'd like to do is, Ms. Thompson, give you an opportunity to just sort of vet that first one that you were talking about before you make the amendment, if you want to sort of reintroduce that here.
Thank you very much. So when we talk about the committee shall be made up of 3 board members, 2 city councilors appointed by the Board of Education upon the recommendation of the city council, and 4 members of the general public associated with each school project. I can see the point of them being from the geographic area of those school projects. And then I do want more at-large participation, and I don't think 2 members is going to make it too unwieldy. So I guess my first thought is to add 2 additional people, the 4 keep as members of the general public associated with each school project, but then 2 at-large. So that's my first one.
Okay, so if people wouldn't mind weighing in on that idea first, we'll have an opportunity to address the whole motion, but Ms. Thompson is wanting to kind of vet the support for this one first. So the idea of adding 2 additional public members. Is there any discussion? Mr. Atkinson.
Yeah, thanks. I really like the idea of adding some at-large representation. I think it's important, like Ms. Davis was saying earlier, to make sure that the entire community feels involved. But then to Ms. Figdor's point, I think it's really crucial that we have someone representing each of the school communities as well. I would hate for Presumpscot, let's say, not to have someone that they feel is representing that community that's making decisions on the schools, and especially given the little bit of wiggle room as far as budgets maybe being able to shift between the school projects. I think it's going to be important to have an advocate for each of the schools, for each of the school communities. So making them all at large would be a non-starter for me.
Ms. Morioni.
I would agree with what Mr. Atkinson just said. I mean, what Ms. Thompson said, but also more importantly around, looking at the makeup of this, if you have a member representing each school, they're all going to be collectively together so that the representative for Lyseth is going to be also hearing what's going on with the other 3 schools. I mean, they're going to be, it's not like they drop out because they're not talking about that school. So in other words, we are having the cross-division of the districts that way already. I do like the idea of the at-large because we only are talking about 3 districts, 2 districts, 3 districts represented. And so to have at-large to make sure we can balance. So I like the idea of additional 2 at minimum, yeah.
Mr. Rodriguez.
Thank you, Chair. So I also like the idea of the members of the public being at large and not restricted to the 3 districts where the schools belong. One question, when the proposal comes through, including 4 members of the public, and I think this was said 2 weeks ago, the idea was that that would allow for a very efficient process. What would be the opinion, superintendent, or whatever staff members would like to share? How much efficiency will we be compromising by adding 2 additional public members of the public?
And I'm open, Steve or Alicia, who've been the primary people, Mrs. Crocker, who's been integrally involved with the process at Hall, to have their thoughts as well. But I think that there's not any sort of sense from staff that the size of the committee makes the decision-making process difficult. I think being able to convene and, get a quorum and be able to actually have meetings where people deal with issues, that's where it gets more complicated, the more people that you have. And so I think that that's the primary force. I think, if we could have a committee of the whole with the whole community, and we could actually convene where people felt that that was a productive conversation, I'd be all for it. But I just don't think that that's realistic, and I think that that's where we came down to the 4 and having them be representatives from each of the school communities, because we do think that having that representation as key decisions are made along the way, that's important. I don't think that adding 2 at-large members would be overly problematic. It would just add 2 more people that we'd have to be able to get to a meeting, or else wind up without a quorum.
Good, thank you. And so that's sort of kind of what my assumption was, that we really wouldn't be compromising efficiency through the process. So having explained that, I think I accept that explanation, and I think that makes me comfortable supporting the idea of adding 2 additional members of the public. And like I said before, I would rather they not be restricted to the districts where the schools belong, but have it open to the entire city. I think that, and I should have started with this, I think that the staff, Superintendent Anna, and everybody involved in this revised recommendation have done a really good job at listening to what the public said 2 weeks ago, what the board members commented on, and the concerns that we had. And I think that what you guys are recommending really reflects that. So, thank you so much for the work that you guys have put on that. So, secondly, what I wanted to say was there is ample opportunity for public participation from each school district through these temporary advisory committees, and that makes me comfortable in regards to including voices from these school neighborhoods, and including voices that we've heard the public mention are going to be critical and important. That aspect of the recommendation, the temporary advisory committees, also makes me feel really comfortable with the recommendation. I think that sort of kind of sealed the deal for me. 2 weeks ago, I was supporting the idea of the project going through the operations committee, and again, this revised version sells me, gets me on board. Yeah, I think that's all I'll say for now.
Other comments, Mr. Belfons?
So what I'm for the staff's proposal, but as Lori suggested, opening it up to at-large, the 4 members opening up at-large beyond the school boundaries, and going off of what Roberto said, I think that we can get enough school representation and input through the advisory groups that'll be made up of not only staff but community members as well. No.
Other comments, students? Anything?
I just want to clarify, so when the applications come in, like, are we the people who are, is this board going to be the people who would, like, choose, like, who's going to be on the committee, or?
So the board has an appointments committee, and that is one of the standing committees of the board that's used for making appointments to different special committees, and so these would be considered special committees. So those applications would be compiled, we would bring them to the appointments committee, they would review them and then make a recommendation, but the board, the whole board would be making would be acting on that slate. So they would bring a slate of people to go into those positions, and the board would approve it, or say, go back and come up with another slate.
Awesome. So if it was like at large, we wouldn't have to worry too much about not having representation in different like communities related to the schools, since the committee or that committee technically will choose someone from each community, correct? Or that's up to their
They would not be
discretion?
obligated to do that unless there was a requirement that we have a representative from each community. I think that was the thinking. Sorry, that was the thinking that went into to saying that it should be a representative from each community, was a way of ensuring, as I think Mr. Atkinson said, if we wind up with, 4 people from Lyseth and nobody from Presumpscot, or something like that.
Yeah, just thinking out loud, I think that's important. And I also think that having 2 people from at large is a good idea. Just open that up, and I don't think it's going to limit the board too much as far as agility or response or efficiency. Thank you.
Mr. Rodriguez.
Thank you. So I just wanted to add to Sarah's recommendation of adding 2 additional members of the public. The other aspect of it that makes me feel comfortable with that is that through the application process, we are going to try to identify folks that understand this is a long-term commitment. So I think we're purposely identifying people that that understand that the commitment is significant, and I think that by doing so, the challenges of coordinating a large group of people to meet multiple times, I think sort of kind of lends itself to be easier, because I purposely identified people that understand the level of commitment that is required and the significance, or rather the importance of their participation and being availability. That's it for now.
Mr. Atkinson.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, there was some talk about districts, and I think that, district gets, it's an overloaded word, as we say in software engineering. It's got a lot of different meanings. My understanding of the intent, I believe, is the school communities. For example, Longfellow, I live in and represent District 4, and my daughter goes to Longfellow School, but Longfellow is not in District 4. So there's some overlap, and they're not exactly the city's district. So I just wanted to make clear that my understanding is that these are representation from the school communities and not the city's districts.
Ms. Davis? I didn't.
Yeah, I'm not responding to that, because you're right. I mean, I have neighbors, a stone's throw from who are in my city district who elected me, who go to Longfellow. I have them go to Hall, I have them go to Ocean Avenue, all within practically view of my home. So, the school district lines and the voting district lines don't line up. But I think one of the things that we have an opportunity to do here is to talk with and signal to the public that Portland is a community. And I really am concerned when we sort of appear to assume that because someone lives somewhere near one school, that they aren't attuned or care about or able to understand and work for the good of someone and a school in another geographic area. I've lived in Portland now for a fairly long time, and in several parts of the city. And while the growth in the neighborhood identification with the city has been positive in many ways. It sometimes has a little bit of negativity as it pulls us apart. And I think this is an opportunity, as I say, the entire Portland community is funding this. And this is an opportunity for the entire Portland community to come together. And I trust someone who lives in District 5 to have the best interest of a school in District 3. You know, that is not and should not be limited by the school you go to. We actually have had someone on the Hall Building Committee who moved in the middle. And while they understood the Hall community, they now are in the Lyseth community. And they care about both communities because both are in Portland. And so I'd like us to sort of take that. We're looking for people who care about all of Portland schools, who are not partisan to one school over another. This is not a competition for funds or a competition for renovations. This is a city project that we're undertaking, and the way that we staff this committee should recognize and support that and signal to our community we are one Portland, and we care about all our schools, and which is where Buildings for Our Future started, was about equity across all of our buildings. And to not assume that because, you know, I'm not a parent of a student at Reiki, that I don't care or understand or am willing to pay for the things that need to be done to bring that school up to where it should be. I think we need to trust each other that we have the best interest of our schools, all our schools at hand, and that the public and the folks we will pick for this committee will share that concern, because I know we share it as a board.
Ms. Thompson.
So, at this time, I want to make an amendment, if I could, and it would be in the third line down, 6 members of the general public, and strike 1 associated with each school project, but raise the number from 4 to 6.
Okay.
That would be my amendment.
Is there a second to that amendment? Mr. Rodriguez. Okay. So we have fully discussed the amendment probably already, but at this time we would have discussion on the amendment. So if there is further discussion on the amendment, I would take it at this time.
I'm sorry, Sarah. Could you just repeat your
Sure.
amendment?
Yep. It would be, the committee would be made up of 3 board members, 2 city councilors appointed by the appointed by the Board of Education upon the recommendation of the city council, and 6 members of the general public, and strike 1 associated with each school project, and strike the number 4 and change it to 6. And then it would be the same, appointed by the board based on a school board appointments committee recommendation.
Can I get a clarification on that? So are those 6 at large?
That would be correct.
Okay.
Did everybody catch that? So it's all 6 at large. Okay. Any further discussion on this? I guess I'm the only one that hasn't spoken yet, so I would just say, you know, I kind of come from a starting place of, I think, where Mr. Balfons and Ms. Davis are. I do like the idea of all of the public representatives being at large, because we can select based on what they bring to the table. I think that the community in which they're embedded and what school community they come from is part of that. That is one thing they bring to the table, but this allows us to look more holistically at the applicants. And you know, coming from a place where we were 2 weeks ago with a much smaller, more tight-knit committee to the recommendation that we have before us today, I am a little concerned about getting bigger and bigger, but it does relieve me to hear that staff believes this is not overly burdensome by adding 2 members. So in that regard, Mr. Rodriguez, what you had said earlier makes sense. When I talked to the superintendent about this a couple weeks ago, you know, I said, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a contractor myself, and so what I think the board needs from staff is really the best recommendation that they can bring to the table, given that they are the experts in the room. So if they're comfortable with it, that seems to make me comfortable So I would feel comfortable supporting this amendment. Any other discussion? Okay. Oh, Mr. Atkinson?
Yes, yeah, I think I have a slightly different take than Ms. Davis I agree completely on the best intentions and would assume the best intentions from community members coming in, but I think that familiarity is an important piece of this, and I would just hate for there to not be someone familiar with each of the schools as a voting member of the committee. So I would prefer to keep the language. I like adding the 6 members, but I would prefer to keep the one associated with each school project myself. So I would that I would be more comfortable getting behind.
So procedurally, the amendment on the table is for 6 at-large members. So we will vote on that first, and then if you want to offer an amendment of your own, you could do that at that time.
Okay, great.
Any other discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, actually, Ms. Thompson, not to put you on the spot, but do you mind just restating the amendment for the vote?
Certainly. Second paragraph, second line, the committee would be made up of 3 board members, 2 city councilors appointed by the Board of Education upon the recommendation of the city council, and 6 members of the general public appointed by the board based on a school board appointments committee recommendation.
All those in favor of that amendment, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have 5 board members in favor and 2 students.
I think I'm catching a misalignment between the language here and the language in the other piece, because I think that the city councilors are appointed to the Board of Education upon the recommendation with input. It's a different piece of language. We've got 2 pieces of language going here, and I want to make sure that we've got the right one because they are slightly different. I don't mean to throw a wrench in the works, but I think that they are.
So is that germane to this particular amendment? Can we maybe just get the amendment done and then we can move to other concerns that you might have? Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, so those in favor, if you could please raise your hands again. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 board members and 2 students voting in the affirmative, and all those opposed. We have Ms. Morioni and Mr. Atkinson opposed.
And to clarify why we're opposed, I'm opposed because Tim was explaining, because we cut out that verbiage of around one associated with each school project. Is that what you were feeling too?
Yes, exactly. I'm not opposed to adding new members.
Not opposed to adding new members, me too. Yeah, okay, that's what I was thinking. Okay, thanks.
So at this time, we are back to the main motion as amended. Ms. Thompson?
I had a second amendment.
Okay, go ahead.
On 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, in the 6th paragraph, where it talks about these groups to be chaired by the public representative, the larger building committee, and the school board representative for that school's geographic district. Starting with each advisory group would have, and I think to get rid of the word up to, 13 representatives selected from, so get rid of by the chairs from the recommendations by the school principal, and insert from the general pool of applicants. So we take out the whole part of by the chairs from recommendations by the school principal and put it as from the general pool of applicants. And then the next line where it says include at least 7 school employees, it would include 7 employees, because if we're going to be at the number 13 and we want 6 community members, we need to stick with 7 school employees, so 6 and 7. So just, if you want me to read that again, I'm happy to.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead and read it.
So under each advisory group would have, strike the word up to, and then leave 13 representatives selected, and strike from the word by the chairs from recommendations by the school principal, strike that whole thing, and insert from the general pool of applicants. and would include, and strike the word "at least."
Can you slow down 1 second?
I'm sorry.
The other applicants.
I can give you my piece of paper if you'd like.
All right. Okay, so what's your silver?
And would include, and then the word "at least," strike that, and leave it as 7 employees, period. 7 in-school employees, and then recommended by the School Board Appointments Committee. So kind of like we closed out the other one, the second paragraph, close out this paragraph with the same language. Based upon, or whatever, School Board Appointments Committee recommendation. And so again, it's removing it from the chair of that advisory group and taking it from the general pool of applicants, which those applicants come into the appointments committee. So that would be the home.
And then you would you then keep the remaining 6 members would be members of the school community, or?
The remaining 6 members would be members of the school community, including parents and other interested. Well, we're saying now that we have the general pool of applicants, so I'm not sure. It's fine to leave it there, and other interested members, because all of it is at large. So, I mean, the verbiage you have in the next carry on is still fine, because it doesn't say, it says and or other. So I think it's broad enough.
Okay.
Is there a second to the amendment? Does everybody understand the amendment? Yes. Was that a second, Ms. Davis? Yeah. Yes, seconded by Ms. Davis. And is there any discussion on the amendment? Mr. Rodriguez? What's that? Oh, sorry. Questions?
Thank you, Chair. So, Sarah, so on your amendment, you're proposing that because this paragraph is speaking of these temporary advisory committees, and you're proposing that the members of the public would not be of the school's neighborhood. You're proposing that these also would be at-large members?
So these could be at large regardless, because the way the language is already written, it's just taking the appointment of those 13 out of the chair from that committee and the school principal, and putting it from, we already have this applicant pool that's going to come in to want to serve in those 6 spots of the larger advisory committee over the school advisory committee. So people have already expressed their interest, and so then some of those people would be considered then to go into the 13 at each of the schools.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Excuse me, I want to hear what the rest of the board has to say about that before we do comments.
Yes. The superintendent has a question.
I just want to be clear, because the paragraph, or the sentence after the sentence that was amended, the remaining 6 members would be members of the school community. I think it was intended to mean that those would be, and that they would be of the school community. So those would be Longfellow parents, they would be Lyseth parents, they would be Reiki parents, they would be Presumpscot parents, when we're talking about that.
Okay, so why don't we just say of the community then, strike the word school? Because we're all actually in school communities overall. I mean, so just strike the word school then, just in the community at large is what I'm trying to get at. So just strike the word school before community.
So, we had a second to it the way that it was, so I believe that the seconder would have to agree. Okay. So now that's the amendment that's on the table. Mr. Rodriguez.
Thank you. I don't want to ask the same question again, but I will. So my understanding, maybe you shouldn't say my understanding, because we're addressing the amendment. I'm sorry, I'm trying to word it. I want to word this correctly. So when you say, Sarah, that these other 6 members, the ones additional to the 7 school employees, are part of the school, are part of the community, again, we're not choosing people that are restricted to the, and I don't want to use district for the same reason that Tim brought it up before, that these are from the boundaries within each school building. That's what you're saying, that these 6 people do not have to live within the boundaries of the school?
That would be correct.
thank you.
Not to
Now-
say they wouldn't apply, but.
Right, thank you. I think now I understand that.
Mr. Atkinson.
I just wanted to point out a little interplay between the last amendment and this one. There were previously representatives from each of the schools that were planning to chair these advisory groups. And so with everything at large now, that may need to be rethought.
Ms. Morioni.
One question still?
Yeah. Good. Any other questions? Seeing none. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
To a question. I guess I don't understand why we are pushing more and more to make sure that the people that are in, I mean, you're absolutely right. We're all contributing to the cost of this. All of Portland taxpayers are contributing to this. What we are asking of this advisory group, however, is that what I understand by it, is that they're the ones who will also be assisting the committee, the operations, the building committee and the board to help disseminate information, to communicate information about the project, and we say here project with the staff, families, and other stakeholders. So it seems to me the more we make these people at large, and the less likely they're going to run into families in the coffee shop next door, or they're going to be a part of that community around that school. Let's not say district per se, but near the boundaries of that school. I just feel like we're watering down the ability for those people to feel engaged, even more engaged as to why would I even potentially, I mean, I totally agree with you. It's not pitting one against the other by any means. It's just, I know personally, I pride myself on these neighborhood schools, and to continue to call them neighborhood schools is also kind of dividing the issue of that we're proud of neighborhood schools, because now we're saying, someone from, another part that. So we just did that for the larger committee, but for the advisory committee, I'm really committed even more so now to the fact that it needs to be someone who somehow has connection to, whether they even have kids that left Longfellow many years ago, but still have some kind of connection to that school and an interest in specifically that neighborhood. So I will not be in agreement at all the more we again keep saying at large, particularly for this advisory committee. So I didn't turn it into a question, I'm sorry. So turning it into a question is, why are we doing this, is I guess my greater question. Not going back to Laurie's explanation, I don't need to know about at-large and picking anybody from Portland, I get that part. But again, for advisory committee, maybe my question would be, what are the responsibilities specifically of these advisory committee members? I'll leave it that, because it doesn't seem to make sense anymore.
I need to just clarify, and maybe I have to withdraw and then redo it, but when I removed it, I was trying to follow up on what the superintendent was saying, and I thought, I completely understand what you're saying. What my general thing was, from the general pool of applicants, I wanted the people that populate this, and so when we removed the word school community, we removed it being within. So I totally get that. When you asked me that question, I kind of messed up by saying, so I will withdraw the motion, but then I want to have the rest of it stay. So do I have to withdraw the whole thing to get rid of put the word school back in?
Right.
Okay, so I will withdraw the motion, and I would like to make an amendment, please.
Okay.
I'm withdrawing my motion.
There was a motion that it was your motion, you amended it, and that amendment was seconded by Lori, so.
I'm withdrawing my motion because I didn't mean to strike the word school.
So you're withdrawing the
my
entire
motion? Yes, and I will start anew and include the word school. Everything else will stay the same.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm making this really fun, I know.
She can do that because, yeah.
Yes, I can.
So is there a second? Does everyone understand what's going on to her amendment, to her new amendment?
Clarification, sorry, guys. This is really... seems to happen to bring me out when I'm sick. So these groups would be chaired by the public representatives on the larger building committee, blah, blah, blah. And then when we get down to each advisory group would have 13 representatives selected from the general pool of applicants and would include 7 school employees. The remaining 6 members would be members of the school community, including parents and other interested members of the public and elected officials. My intention was not to strike the word school, and I got kind of flustered, I think, when the superintendent had asked me that question, so I apologize for making more work for everybody.
Okay. Is there a second to that amendment? Mr. Rodriguez? Any questions on the motion? Ms. Davis?
I guess I'm going to ask the question back, why are we excluding people who don't happen to have children in our schools? They are the minority of the people who live in the city, and I think this does
It says, and
exclude.
other interested members, Lori.
Okay.
It says, and other interested members of the public. So that's where that brings in those people outside of.
But you are limiting it to a school community. And I think that that is assuming that only people who live in somehow, and we haven't defined school community. I could essentially walk in and say, I'm the member of 3 school communities: Hall, Ocean Avenue, and Longfellow. I have a reason and an interest, particularly in the geographic place where I live, in all 3 of those schools. The reality is I care about Reiki, I care about Peaks. And by putting that in there, you have signaled to me that I am not welcome at this table. And I think that's a mistake for this board, after having just asked our community for them to fund this, to then turn around and say that because of where you live and whether we define you as being part of that school community, which is, I think, a geographic designation, there really isn't a good definition of it unless we're talking school district boundaries, that we are excluding members of residents of Portland. And I can't support anything that excludes at the get-go people who are going to pay the bills for this. That's not right. They should have an opportunity to put their names forward. They may or may not be selected, because as someone said, the fact some of what you may be bringing to the table is that you are embedded in a particular community. You may bring forward that you are embedded in another group, that you have a network of other people and connections that you bring to the table. But to say at the beginning that, in essence, as we do so often with schools, that only parents have an active voice and they're the only ones we should be listening to, I think is a mistake for us as a community. We need the entire community's support through this long project and to continue to support our budgets. So I think that it would be a mistake to exclude anyone in our language.
Ms. Morioni?
I actually would prefer to increase the number of 6 members of the public in this one, because, again, help me if I'm misunderstanding this. The point of these advisory groups is basically like a public forum, in a sense, for them to hear where we are in the process and to get feedback from them, like a public hearing of how is this going, and it could be, honestly, I don't even think we need to have even a number. I don't think that needs to be as structured with exact number, and I hear Lori's point in that, and I don't think, again, 6 members, that means, okay, 2 for each school, and that's really very limiting. Again, I think, we could increase that number, and anyone from the community could come and essentially make this more of an advisory group that, I don't know.
So
it's a thought.
We have an amendment on the table, and that amendment, it essentially makes it so that the 6 members are being picked from the original pool of applicants and not by any other appointed people. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up to both questions and discussion, since it seems like that's the way we're going anyway. But if we could keep discussion to the amendment. Yeah. Other discussion.
Sorry, I've caused this confusion, so do you want me to read it again, or are we okay? Is everybody okay with?
Read it again.
Okay, good, read it again? Okay, thank you. I'm so sorry. So each advisory group would have 13 representatives selected from the general pool of applicants. and would include 7 school employees, period. And then, excuse me, 7 school employees recommended by the Appointments Committee, as we said in the previous paragraph.
Okay. Does everyone understand the amendment? Is there further discussion? Ms. Morioni?
Who are these 7 school employees, and why do we need all 7 of them going to the advisory group? I mean, I'm having difficulty understanding the definition or the responsibility of this advisory group, because we're reporting out, we're receiving feedback, end of story, right? Again, I'm just clarifying, and I'm sorry if it's not attached to the amendment necessarily, except the fact that 7 school employees, I mean, we're running our school employees ragged as is, and if they're going to this meeting, and I don't know, sorry.
So I guess we're on the motion of just amending from the general pool of applicants, and then at the end of employees, so if Ms. Morioni wants to make a motion to change the 7 employees, that could be the next motion, but for now, if we could stick to this general motion we're talking about, that would be great, so we can move along.
So I have a question. We're assuming that we're going to have enough applicants in this pool to go ahead and put in these advisory groups. What happens if we don't?
Right. We've never had, and never say never, I know here, but anytime the school department or the school board has reached out to the community, we have huge support. So we've had focus groups, we've had community conversations, and actually a lot of people come. So I'm less worried about people not applying and having a lot of replies. Should we get to that point, then we can deal with it at that time, come back to the board and say, hey, we haven't had enough applicants, we're really concerned here. But in my personal opinion, I don't think we'll have that problem, but certainly as a secondary, we would have to come back to the board, the Appointments Committee would, and say we don't have enough applicants to cover all of this.
I would offer another answer to that, which is that we could open it back up for applications, for additional applications. Mr. Rodriguez.
Thank you. So I don't want to try to answer Ms. Morioni's question, but I want to ask if the verbiage here answers her question. So at the very last sentence where it says the advisory group would advise the larger board specific design elements for each school project and how to best communicate about the project with staff, family, and other stakeholders. So is, how much, I mean, I want to know, does that definition of the advisory committee's charge, does that help you in any way? No? Yeah.
I'm not going to take over the chair's role, but right now we have the motion in front of us is just from the general pool of applicants amendment and recommended by the Appointments Committee. So if we could finish up that one, and then we can change anything else you guys heart desire, but to keep the chair from going not insane and the superintendent, if we could just stick to this amendment and get that done, and then we could move on to the next concern of Ms. Morioni or whoever, that would be great. Thank you.
Mr. Atkinson.
Thank you. I just wanted to point out that the applications are due very soon, right, and over the holiday break, and so it's possible that that there would be people, if let's say we're getting to Longfellow 3 years down the road, that may now suddenly be interested. So I think it would be crucial that that the application will be opened back up and not be limited to just that initial group, if this carries.
I think that as worded, that would allow for the applications to be opened back up. Any other discussion on this amendment? Okay. Seeing none, I would call for a vote, and if Ms. Thompson could read the amendment one more time.
Okay. Each advisory group would have 13 representatives selected from the general pool of applicants and would include 7 school employees, and then at the end, the recommendation appointed by the board based on a school board appointments committee recommendation, period, the end.
And I would call for a vote. All those in favor of that amendment, please indicate. It is 1, 2, 3, with both of the students in the affirmative and all those opposed. 1, 2, 3, 4, and the motion fails. Okay, so we're back to the main motion as amended by the First Amendment. Are there any other amendments and/or discussion? Ms. Davis.
I guess I'm torn, because I think we're getting into the place we don't like to be, which is that we're trying to amend something that needs really a little more work than a couple of quick amendments. And given that we've already heard that the Appointments Committee can't meet based on the timeline that was presented here, I'm wondering whether it makes sense to table this to the January 2nd meeting, and both the board and staff kind of work on getting some of these, I think we're clearer about what's important to people, and that we can work with each other to figure out how to come to something that probably doesn't need to be amended on the fly when we get here, and that we could just pass. So I'd like to move to table this to the January 2nd meeting.
Okay. We have a motion to table on the floor, and I believe that does not need a second. And we would move to vote directly on the motion to table. So do you want to discuss? Mr. Rodriguez?
I just wanted to add another point. So we've made a lot of progress so far. Right now, we're simply discussing the advice. Someone's got to keep track, right? We certainly have, by the way, at least in my opinion. Right now, we're discussing these advisory committees. How disruptive to our timeline is it if we push this down? Because these advisory committees will essentially not really be called upon until we're ready to discuss the actual building project. So although we need to start forming them, they will not need to meet right away. And that's my assumption. Let's say, for example, if we're going to have the last building number 4 in the timeline, that advisory committee won't get formed, I'm assuming, in January, right? Because they won't be meeting until 2020 or something, which seems a little bit kind of jumping the gun, so to speak. So again, with Lori's recommendation that we move this to the January meeting, is that disruptive to our timeline? And did what I should say make sense?
So it is, I don't know the answer to that. It is obviously disruptive to the timeline that we've proposed. I don't know that we make it up in time to begin that process. And I also, obviously, there are decisions that need to be made, that's why we need to have this governance committee, but I don't know that it's, the world comes to an end if it isn't appointed on the 18th. It doesn't look like the 18th is a possibility anyway, so I think that, it moves us to the first February meeting to actually have a slate of people to be on the building committee.
Ms. Thompson?
So we don't table this, and we actually make progress tonight, because we've been talking about it for so long. Can we, to Mr. Rodriguez's point, leave the consideration action to the first 4 paragraphs, and then where it says additionally, and goes on to the second page, have that come back from staff at a later time, so we can get this at least this school building committee. We've already, I think, hashed that one to death, and I'm just wondering if we can't just have the motion, the four paragraphs, and remove for now from the motion, from the word additionally all the way to the end, and then have that part come back to us at a future meeting, so we can keep moving ahead with the top part. Does that make any sense whatsoever? So that way we're not stymied by, we've done some progress, we get that going, and then this parent, oh boy, oh boy. Yes, Mr. Rodriguez, I agree. The additionally, because I think we all have different takes on how these should be made up. We've already all agreed on the other part, so let's let that stay, and then we'll come back and have you give us another recommendation for this parent community, whatever it's going to be called, pool. Because to Mr. Rodriguez's point, we need to get moving on the core, and then that other part will feed into it. So I guess I would ask for the board's consideration, not to table the whole thing, but just from additionally all the way to the end, bring that back later and vote on the first 4 paragraphs.
So I have an idea of how to do it procedurally. So I think procedurally how we would do that, we would need to withdraw the motion to table, and we would need an amendment that would read consideration and action to create an advisory building committee as a standing board committee consistent with the superintendent's recommendations as outlined in paragraphs 1 through 4 of the background summary. So I guess I would ask Ms. Davis. Oh, Ms. Morioni, did you want to speak first and then Ms. Davis? You had your hand up.
I just had a quick request. When we're going out, when we're requesting people to apply, could we possibly have like a box that they check that they want to be on one or the other or both? Only because, I mean, what if there's a community member that really would rather be on the advisory specific to that school project and not all 4? And so we would automatically already have people, oh, look, they would just move them along to the advisory group decision-making process when it comes. Just an idea.
Ms.
Thank you. I had a question just procedurally with, if we do table this and come back to it at the next meeting, what does that mean for the amendments that we've made in the current proposal? Does any of that sort of stick because we've been voting on it tonight?
Yes. Ms. Davis?
My feeling when you are developing a governance structure is that it's important in many times to go slow to go fast, and that working out these details in advance and thinking it through as a total picture is really critical. We can do it in bits and pieces, but we will end up with bits and pieces at the end that we're trying to glue together. And so that's a concern. There's still language, the language in the background summary of what we're sort of approving doesn't align completely with the language in the PowerPoint, because, for example, identification of city councilors, board chair with council input, and then we say that we're going to, upon recommendation of the city council. Those are 2 different things. That's 2 different ways of identifying city councilors. We talk, again, in the PowerPoint about the portion where if your tenure on the board or council changes, then there's something that happens, but this part only talks about the school board. I'd really suggest to us that we just take the time to get this right. I'm not hearing that we're really going to delay the timetable because the appointments committee can't meet. There are questions already raised about that may apply to the format of application that we're putting out. And we're frankly in the middle of a holiday season. Many people are out of town, and we've talked so much about wanting to have the public feel like they really have an opportunity to weigh in, whether they're part of a school community or the general public at a whole. And we're doing this at a time when people are often really focused on family and other things and not at work and maybe not even reading the newspaper or whatever we're publicizing this in. So no, I'm not willing to withdraw my motion. I think this is one where we will, down the road, boards may thank us for having taken the time to actually think it through and get it right at the outset as a full package and not leave a lot of stuff kind of hanging to be determined, probably in the midst of a disagreement or adversarial kind of situation where people are interpreting something that we left a little vague. So I'd like us to vote on the motion, and I would urge us to take the time to do this right and bring it back at our January 2nd meeting.
So you have to get a second on that in order for that to go through.
On the table?
On the tabling, it has to have a second, according to Robert's Rules of Order.
Okay. Is there a second for the tabling motion? Seeing none, the motion fails for lack of a second. So we're back to the main motion. Ms. Davis.
Then in that case, we need to, I think, reconcile what was in the PowerPoint with what's in the motion that we're considering. And what we have in the motion we're considering in the second paragraph is that the city councilors are appointed by the Board of Education upon the recommendation of the city council. But what we said over here was identification of city councilors was done by the board chair with council input. Those, to me, don't read as the same thing. Which is it that we want to do? So that's the first issue. There's a second one as well that has to do with the council. But let's deal with them one at a time.
Ms. Morioni.
On that note, I would like to go by what we have in writing to approve instead of what's in the PowerPoint, because, yeah, what we have in writing, backup material versus the PowerPoint, and if we can all consistently agree with that, then we don't have to.
Then I move that we change the language to agree with the PowerPoint, which is that the city councilors are appointed by the Board of Education after having been identified by the board chair with council input.
Okay. Is there a second to that amendment? Ms. Morioni. Does everyone understand the amendment that's on the table? Is there any discussion on the amendment? Seeing no discussion on the amendment, I will call for a vote on the amendment. Ms. Davis, would you like to restate it for the vote?
The two city councilors are appointed by the Board of Education after having been identified by the Board of Education chair with council input. And we strike upon the recommendation of city council.
Okay. All those in favor of that language as amended? It is unanimous for the students voting in the affirmative. And we're back to the main motion. Ms. Davis.
And the second issue is, in the PowerPoint, we indicated that if either a school board member or a city councilor, and I'm trying to find the right spot in here, the membership terms, duration clearly defined, that elected officials continue to serve until no longer on the board council. But in the words, we need to add back in, this is the third paragraph, it should say, school board and city council membership on this committee would be for the length of the committee or councilor member's tenure on the board or council. If a member retires, resigns, or is not re-elected, the board chair would appoint a replacement. So it's just making it consistent between the two bodies.
Is there a second to that amendment? Mr. Balfons. Does everyone understand that amendment? Okay. Is there any discussion on that amendment? Seeing none, I will call for a vote. All those, do you want to read it again for the vote?
That the school board and city council membership on this committee would be for the length of the committee member's tenure on the board or council. If a member retires, resigns, or is not elected, the board chair would appoint a replacement.
Okay. All those in favor of that amendment? Please indicate. Sorry, I didn't catch everybody. It's unanimous with the students voting in the affirmative. We are on a roll. We're back to the main motion. Other amendments or discussion? Mr. Rodriguez.
Should we add language that locks in the creation of these temporary advisory groups? Because the way that it is right now, as we decided to kind of wait to do that later, I'd like the language here today to say that that is part of the obligation, that we will definitely include that. But yet, obviously, how we do that will come later.
So We didn't actually make an amendment to only consider the first 4 paragraphs.
Okay,
So they are still in the language currently,
my bad.
unless anybody wants to make an amendment. Ms.
Okay,
Davis?
I'll do another motion, that we limit what we vote on tonight to the first 4 paragraphs, that we delete, I guess it's the last 2, and substitute language that says just use the first sentence, that additionally, the administration proposes to institute a school, not school-based, you'll lose me there. I think we leave those out, and we charge, perhaps come up with language that charges the staff to bring us back an advisory group structure at a later date.
Okay. That's an amendment. Is there a second? Mr. Rodriguez? Is there any discussion on the amendment? Ms. Thompson?
Sorry. So for now, we're removing the last 2 paragraphs, is that correct?
And replacing them with the charge to the superintendent to bring back a recommendation.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Mr. Atkinson?
I think in addition to charging the superintendent with coming back with a recommendation, I'd like some sort of statement of intent to proceed with the advisory groups. I think that would make me feel a lot more comfortable with the whole thing, because if we just say we'd like a recommendation, we're not actually committing to that.
So I'm going to call that a clarifying question and ask Ms. Davis to state the actual language.
Sort of writing it on the fly here, but I think the language is, and the board charges the superintendent to bring back a recommendation for creation of advisory groups for each school building project. And I think we would have difficulty committing ourselves to a future vote.
Right.
But we can commit ourselves to considering it in the future. And I think from the discussion tonight that we'll consider it. It won't go away. And I'm sure the public won't let it go away either, nor should they.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Great. Mr. Balfons?
So if tonight we go ahead with the first 4 paragraphs but delete the last 2, what does that do for our timeline? Are we able to proceed with appointments? Are we able to keep moving forward at that point? Or do we need to wait for the other 2 paragraphs or for the explanation and vote on the advisory groups?
I believe that we can still move forward with the appointment of the building committee as originally proposed. I know that there are concerns that have been raised logistically in terms of the appointments committee being available during that time, and even the length of the outreach for applications, but there's nothing in what you've done so far that changes our ability to do that.
Ms. Morioni?
A couple of things, since we are about to decide on whether to move that for staff to bring forward another recommendation around this. Not only the intent, again, of these advisory groups, but I really still some questions that if we're having questions about, I know the public would be having even more questions about, which is, okay, so again, I need to know a little bit more about these 7 school employees and the intent around those, as well as I would really like it to go ahead and be identified as to which of the board members are the advisory group chairs, only because, as we've discussed, not all of us, we represent different schools, and it would just be good to go ahead and have that finalized, just so we're not mired in who's doing what when the time comes. It could be helpful. We may or may not be able to do that, only because, let's say, a school is, 4 years down the road, and we might not know which, that actual person is. But just some more clarity around that. And I still would also like to advocate for, instead of just saying remaining 6 members, to grow that number, only because, again, if the intent is to for outreach purposes in the community, 6 seems pretty small. Okay, thanks.
Other discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I would call for a vote. All those in favor of the amendment as outlined by Ms. Davis? It's unanimous with the students in the affirmative. And so now, we are back to the main motion, which is consideration and action to create an advisory building committee as a standing board committee consistent with the superintendent's recommendations as amended. And it's already on the table, so we don't need to move it in again. Any discussion on the main motion? Seeing none, I would, yep, Mr. Rodriguez.
I promise this one Deraila. So we just, through this discussion tonight, there was a lot of procedural, hiccups. I can't imagine that everybody was keeping up. I know along the way I kind of lost track. So if we can, when we put something in the website, when we amend the PDF or whatever, if we can just try to clarify everything that just happened in the last 20 minutes. You understand me, because it really was, we went really fast. That's all I have to say.
Ms. Davis.
And I'd just like to compliment the board on really, we worked in public on camera and got this done. And I'm glad that we were able to get to this point.
I would say the same thing. I know that it was a bit of a challenge and seems hard to follow, but this is process and we've accomplished great work. And following this vote, we're about to have a building committee. So that's significant, and that's significant to the public as well, I think. So unless there's any other discussion, I would call for a vote. All those in favor of creating an advisory building committee as a standing board committee consistent with the superintendent's recommendations as amended, please indicate. It's unanimous with the students voting in the affirmative. All right, we're on to personnel. Consideration and action to approve the personnel item listed. Is there a motion? Ms. Morioni, seconded by Mr. Balfons. Would the superintendent like to speak to the motion?
This is a request for the board to approve the election of probationary teacher. This is a half-time ELL position that is open at Lincoln Middle School, and it's within our budget.
Okay. Any questions on the motion? Seeing none, where this is a personnel item, there is no public comment. Is there any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I will call for a vote. All those in favor of approving the personnel item listed, please indicate. It's unanimous with the students in the affirmative. And Member Thompson is out of the room. And we're on to board focus on educational issues. We have a presentation from the Bar Foundation. Would the superintendent like to present that?
Yes, very quickly, and I would like to say thank you to the many partners who are in the room today to show their support for this presentation. The Bar Foundation, as I know the board knows, is the largest private foundation in the state of Massachusetts, and it is currently seeking New England-based grantees that are interested in establishing programs that provide high-quality educational options to students who are at risk or have dropped out of a traditional high school. As you know, as part of the Portland Promise and our achievement goal, we're committed to increasing the percentage of students who graduate from high school prepared and empowered to 92% in the next 5 years. This proposal is one way in which we are planning to increase our ability to meet the diverse needs of our students, and I will turn this over to Assistant Superintendent Malia Nally, who's been leading the district's side of this effort, because as you'll see, there are many partners in this process, along with our partners in this effort. So, Malia?
Great, thanks. Good evening. Just to build on Superintendent Botana's comment, we have partners from LearningWorks, JMG, Muskie, and consultant Aaron, who are in the audience and who've been supporting this. So when we get to questions, perhaps you guys can come up and help me out with that. So our goal for this conversation, which is probably going to be a little bit more brief than the last one, is just building background context. So we just want you to better understand the opportunity before us, how we see the need, and how that lines up with the opportunity, and then ultimately to make sure you're clear about our next steps. So in terms of building some context around the opportunity itself, the RFP is designed to target solutions for students who are off track to graduate. So these are high school age students. There is some flexibility within the grant opportunity for us to define a more specific student profile or target population. But in general, as you can see here, they speak to students who are already enrolled in high school but who are significantly off track to be able to graduate. Rising ninth graders who are significantly off track, they use the 1.5 years or more behind from an achievement perspective, and or disconnected or not enrolled youth who are have already dropped out of high school. So that's kind of the large frame to which students we're talking about this particular program targeting. In terms of what this is designed to enable us to do, I think there's a few key points to understand. Yeah? So is this the PowerPoint? I don't think you have the PowerPoint. Yeah. Yes. Yes. So a few just things on what they're focused on. So first is just that it's a wholly integrated and full-time model. So this is not necessarily a program that sits within the existing school where students just access it for bits and pieces, but the intention and the vision here is that it's a fully integrated full-time model, that it is specifically designed to help students achieve and receive their full proficiency-based high school diploma with a meaningful post-secondary plan. Also, it needs to be opt-in. So this is not something where we would send students or require that they have to go, but rather students would opt into this program if they felt it would meet their specific needs better and make them more successful in high school. And then finally, this would need to serve a minimum of 100 students at scale, not in its first year of implementation, but over a few years. In terms of the funding specifically, what we're applying for now is just a planning grant. So this is this year one up to $150,000 that would support planning. And then after the planning year, kind of in the middle of the planning year, we would apply for the implementation launch funds, which are for up to $750,000. And these funds, as described here, are really about the launch. They're not for ongoing operating fees. So this is for the staff to kind of design and lead this work, for consultation, and for other things like that. So, in terms of the need in Portland specifically, I think when looking at our data, and Angela's here, so you can chime in with me, especially if folks have questions in a moment, but we know that we have a group of students who drop out every year, and we know that historically we tend to have higher dropout rates than many of our peer districts. When you look at our pattern over time, on average, we have about 76 students who drop out per year. In terms of who those students are, here what you're looking at is a specific snapshot of the 2015 cohort. And I think we use this just as an example, and I think trends are similar across the other cohorts. And the thing to look at here is what's shaded in gray. So these are the groups that are overrepresented when we disaggregate who's making up the group of students who drop out. So specifically, we see that there's a high percentage of this group of students who are economically disadvantaged, male, have had limited English proficiency, are homeless, or have been refugees. We also think about early warning indicators. So these are not necessarily causal, but they're just things that, research has shown you should be looking at that can indicate there's concern for dropouts. So one of the things we look at is chronic absenteeism. And so here you're just looking at it by the 9th, 10th, and 11th graders. And this is absent more than 10% of the days up to the point where you take that look. And so you can see we have, a sizable group there. We also look at other early warning indicators, such as students who are significantly off track based on achievement scores of 1.5 grade levels or below, who are far behind in terms of their credit, who have multiple failures. And so here again, you can see these are the numbers of students that, have those things in their background. So 129 of 9th graders, this was, I think, last year's data, who were 1.5 grade levels or more behind in terms of their achievement levels, and kind of right on down the board there. So as far as next steps go, we're still very much at the kind of visioning stages. So we did apply last year. I think Javier mentioned that, and that was in the materials. We did not obviously receive the grant, but we did get great feedback. And I think specifically what we heard were that the strengths of our application included the fact that we had a very student-centered design, and that we had a really thoughtfully integrated set of community partners that we envisioned bringing to this type of a program. What they wanted us to clarify is really more around the instructional vision. And I think partly for us that was clarifying because I think we envisioned a lot of that work happening in the planning year, and I think they wanted us to get a little bit more concrete with what we're imagining in the actual application itself. And so what we're working on is listed out here. So first is we're in the midst of really securing all the commitments with the partners. So this is the application that would go in for South Portland, Westbrook, and Portland together. So this is definitely a regional program. And so we're working with the superintendents and teams in those districts to make sure we're fully aligned before we proceed and submit the application. Also, we're figuring out who's the right lead partner for this work. So we would have a partner who really is the fiscal agent who applies to be the lead on hiring the staff and really running this program with a lot of input, of course, from the districts. We have LearningWorks and JMG both here with us this evening, and those have been two partners who are deep in these conversations with us and definitely have a competency set that's well aligned with many of the things that we're trying to do here. We have Aaron Townsend, who's here as a consultant. He has some really rich background in terms of thinking about innovative models, funding high schools, funded by some support from Muskie to support our design process. And we're still really honing in on the student profile, as well as some of those program model components. We have a meeting, I think, Emily, January 2nd with a larger team of people who was working on this since last year. It includes teachers, social workers, partners. So that team is coming back to the table on January 2nd to do a lot of the work that's described here that we need to further refine in our second application. And so timeline-wise, I just spoke to these things, but we're finalizing this application with partners, focusing on those commitments, getting really clear on the lead partner and some of those evolutions to our vision. The actual application is due at the end of January, and then we would find out in July if we receive the grant. And then I mentioned before, this is for the planning grant, and so during that year we would apply for the implementation grant, and that we would find out about in July of 2019. So those are just, I mean, like I said, this is just kind of beginning to build a little bit of background context. And so we wanted to make sure you all were in the loop and kind of brought up to speed. So that's the basics, and I'm happy to answer questions. And like I mentioned, there's several folks that have been working on this that are here tonight as well, and they can chime in too. Anything, Javier, anything you would add, by the way? Okay. Great. Ms. Tom.
Thank you, Malia. I just have a question, having been here when we did Nellie Mae. Can you talk to us a little bit about, we committed, and I'm not saying one is the same, but we committed ourselves to the Nellie Mae. We had an MOU after we got the money, and it was very spelled out clearly. How does this compare in how we did the Nellie Mae work and how spelled out it was? And I know that Nellie Mae, for instance, had like certain policy changes and check-ins and things of that nature. I just want to know the differences and similarities between the two, because I know that there was some concerns after we implemented Nellie Mae, but the betterment outweighed the concerns. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Do you want to start? You look like you're going to, do you want to start with that?
I want to point out that none of the people here were around when you entered into the agreement with Nellie Mae, so I think we are talking from, well, and that's right. So David, you can come on up and and answer that question. So none of us were around, so it's hard to sort of answer that question directly. So what I want to be very clear about is that this is the implementation grant. We know that what we're proposing to do is a very significant project that would be significantly different from what we're currently doing. And so if you go back or actually to the slide that's up there, we wanted to stress the fact that clarifying commitments is a really important part of the next steps. We need to know what's expected from us to to move to the application, and then we'll have to do that again to move to the implementation. So at this point, we are very much in the exploratory phase. We are working hard with a large group of people to make sure that we have something that we want to move forward. And, if we don't have the commitment from our partner districts, if we don't have the right lead partner, if we understand, as this meeting on January 2nd and subsequently tells us that these are the commitments that need to be made, and we don't feel that we can make those commitments, we're not locked into submitting this application.
So just to follow up to that, Javier, so the one thing I was thinking about with Nellie Mae is we had some positions, and then we slowly had to either do away with them or integrate them into the local budget, and then had layoffs and so on and so forth. So I guess that's one of my concerns is budgetary with once we get into this.
Yeah.
And then committing these positions, doing this route, and then not having the money. So
it would require an ongoing cost to the district. So the startup work is, the startup work, but you're correct that if we were to start this program, it would need to continue to run in terms of the school leadership and the teachers and the wraparound services. Now, we imagine in our design that community partners would really kind of make up part of this team, and they would need funding as well. And we know that the opportunity through the 3 districts sending, through the lead partner, would bring different revenue sources, I think, to the table. But I do think, and Javier definitely clarify from here, but this would mean if we launched this and started this, there would be an ongoing operating cost that would be associated with it.
And so let me just try to be even a little clearer on that. The commitments for the implementation year, as I understand it, would all be paid for from the from the planning year would be paid for through the Nellie Mae grant. I think the commitment going forward, from BAR, the commitment going forward would be for us to think about this really no differently from the way that we think about sending kids out of district for special education placements and things along those lines, where it's a tuition cost. So this would be a program that we would, in essence, that we, Westbrook, South Portland, would tuition students to, and that would be the ongoing commitment that we would be making.
Okay, so to that point, Javier, and then somebody last, so the implementation, kind of like we got the Gates money, we got the Nellie Mae money, we did all that implementation, great. Before we, if we're chosen from this foundation, and before we accept that we were chosen and taking the money, does it come back to the board to say, here's the amount of money we're taking, and here's what we think long-term will be the cost to the district before we sign on the dotted line to say, yes, we want your money?
Yes, exactly. I think the board is always, the board always has to act on financial commitments, and we would be making a very significant financial commitment on a per-pupil basis for this program going forward. So yes, that would absolutely be a board.
Thank you.
Thank you, Malia, and thank you to all the people who've waited a long time for us to discuss this. I would very much like, as Ms. Thompson pointed out, even though staff wasn't here when we did Nellie Mae, I would love for a final report to the board of how that ended up. Even if we said, you know what, we thought it would work well, these were the places that it didn't quite meet our expectations, wherever we landed with that. We haven't gotten back to, back to the board, because that was a lot of money too. And it was very, very similar to this in terms of the time frame, and in terms of the partners are actually the same, JMG and Learning Works, which we love them. It's great to have partners, and it's great to get free money if we can get this grant. It's awesome. But I think as a board member who's been here and that all through of those stages, it's really important, as to Ms. Thompson's pointing out, the integration part of it, this, how we can ensure that this is something that's sustainable.
Yep, and I heard you say you would like to hear some, what do we learn from the Nellie Mae grant process?
And we don't even need, a full presentation, or even a report, a printed.
Yes, and we have, there is a end-of-year report, I believe.
There is an end-of-year report, but we're not, we still are receiving Nellie Mae funding, so there is no end-of-project report, so.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's good that but we're in our last year of it now, right?
Yeah.
So I guess soon, we'd like to, I personally would like to see, okay, how is that working, and why aren't we continuing on Nellie Mae with their funding, or did that money just run out, and what still remains of that, and did get integrated? Because to also Ms. Thompson's point, we did hire people, and are those still people now we're paying out of our budget, or now we are, okay, end of, when Nellie Mae ends, these staff people will no longer be doing that work. Just a clarification around that, that's all.
And I think just to, absolutely, and I think that will surface in our budget conversations. I do think in terms of the money, it was by design, and everybody knew kind of where, how long this was going to last, with the idea that we would be building capacity within the schools over the course of the grant. There are, you're right, some positions that were funded through that money that we are deep in the middle of conversations about. I'm looking at Jeannie because we've been in many conversations to think about our solutions for that moving forward, and I think that will come up pretty transparently, if I'm understanding correctly, at our budget conversations.
I do see definitely differences between what the intent was for that money and this. But when we say doing high school differently, the public has heard this time and time again. So we just need to be, I think, sometimes careful around really honing in on, this seems to be, from what it says here, is that we're looking at 10th graders and older, 10, 11, 12. Being in this, and my question around that also has to do with why. Why start at 10th grade when we know back in middle school we already have people falling behind? Once they get 10th grade, it seems a little bit like they're already on a trajectory that could be very hard to turn around. Maybe I'm completely wrong. I'm not an educator around this at all. But just a question around, why wouldn't we be starting younger? And then the other question I had was around, you had listed program models. and you put up there experiential learning. And so just a little more clarification. You said you're working that through and looking at what types you're going to determine. I just also want to be cognizant of the fact that when we say experiential learning in high school, we're talking Casco Bay. So I mean, we have it in all of our high schools. We've got it all in our high schools. But I just, for the public's consumption and so forth, those are things that sort of popped out in my mind. However, like I said, we love grant money. It's really wonderful to have, but it's just sort of, sorry, I'm kind of poking holes in the grand scheme of it, just because we've been there before, too. Thank you.
No, that's helpful. That's very helpful on the framing, too. And just to clarify, the experiential learning and the program models, not expeditionary learning. I think that it was talking about just generally some of the components of a really student-centered, flexible schedule that's really non-traditional, and the idea that there would be a lot of connections to jobs and real-life experience. But like I said, that's the big work on January 2nd for us to shape that up a little bit more, and then that's really what will get fleshed out in the planning year.
Lori?
I share Ms. Thompson's and Ms. Morioni's concern about sustainability. Grants are useful when you actually are using the money to do something that you think and you have a fairly good sense you want to do anyway. They can become disruptive and difficult and actually create problems when they get you doing stuff you're not willing to actually pay for down the road. And I think before we went too far with this, I would want to see a real quantification of the ongoing costs, because like Nellie Mae, we essentially backed into taking on some stuff that the board had never really discussed in any detail. And there are 4 of us who were here, and that we spent 2.5 hours debating whether or not to accept that money. And I'm not, at this point in time, completely convinced that it was in our best interest to have done so. That grants come with costs. And so I think we need to be really clear about what it is that we would be asking to do long-term, because we're taking on building costs, we approved increases to our base unit. I hear increases. I'm not seeing where we're going to cut. And I am very concerned about the burden on taxpayers going forward. The other pieces, and help me understand, I guess we're talking about, why would we have an outside fiscal agent? We pay overhead to an outside entity rather than managing that internally?
That's a requirement of the grant.
Okay, to not have fiscal control over it and to pay overhead to a third party?
Isn't that right? Isn't that
No,
it's an external partner has to be the applicant?
There's strong preference given to groups that have a outside partner as the lead. So there's that, plus the regional aspect of it. So it's not just a Portland program. It really is designed to be all 3 districts. I mean, just to your point, like the assumption of the overhead costs and all of that, I think gets to your earlier point, which is what are the projected costs over time, which I totally agree with. Emily's in the audience. I sort of direct quoted you when I was like, oh. So absolutely. And I think that so remember this particular application is for planning,
right,
which I mean, that's one of the biggest priorities, I think, in the planning year is what would this look like operationally from a budget and sustainability perspective. And I mean, it is possible that in that planning year, we come to a conclusion that there isn't a sustainable way to do this, and we don't go for implementation, but it spurs a lot of really deep, good thinking about how do we better serve this consistent group of students that are, not getting the outcomes that we think they can get. So, yeah.
I guess the thinking with anytime there's a cost to grants management, and so just wondering if it is indeed required to have the fiscal agent be outside, because then we're going to be paying an outside entity's overhead costs. That generally is a part of the charge, and as somebody who pays a significant amount of my grant to USM to just be there. I would rather be paying the district than paying an outside entity. So that's one thing. I assume student input would come along in this. So but I guess I am and perhaps that's part of the planning year, to gather what do students actually feel would be helpful in this.
Lori, can I just clarify one? That's a great point. I'm really happy you raised that. So absolutely, and in fact, that's one of the core requirements, is that there's pretty significant youth voice in the design and envisioning of this particular program. We have had a youth focus group this past year to help shape, draft one. We have other groups, Emily, when are they, do we have the dates yet, or we have the, yeah, that are being scheduled, so, and that are youth-led in terms of even getting the word out, and then definitely there would be a significant role for youth in the planning year. So I just wanted to underscore that, because I'm glad you raised that point.
And I guess along with that, I would also hope that, because I have seen grants that are very youth-led, and while I value youth voice, I think there's also a role for expertise and knowledge, and that different people have different takes on that, and so it's pulling that all together. Am I correct in understanding that the goal of this is to create something that we send students away to and tuition them out of our existing 3 high schools? In essence, we're talking about creating a 4th high school program of regional for at-risk kids, only for at-risk kids?
Yes, this would be something students would opt in to attend for their high school years. Currently, we had it at 10th, but that's still in conversation. So they would opt into it because they would feel like that's the sort of flexible structure, the different kind of highly student-centered design would suit their needs better. But yes, I would say in essence, yes.
I think one of the things we would have to consider very carefully, and they're going to be twofold, because we have members of the community who still feel, and pardon the Casco Bay folks in the room, that we do not need 3 high schools. And we'll talk very vigorously about the cost of having and maintaining 3 high schools, especially as our enrollment drops. We've lost students to Baxter, we lose students to the private schools. We're talking about essentially pulling more students out of our existing program, maybe to serve them better, but we have an enrollment issue. So I think we need to really see, that's part of the sustainability, is what is the hit taken with each of our 3 high schools? And is that a sustainable financial hit over time? So there's a lot that I would want to I think there's some very serious questions, because we're talking about designing something that takes 100 students away, which is not enough to reduce the cost in any one of our high schools.
And the one thing,
would cost to administer separately. And I have philosophical issues, just me personally, my educational philosophy would not separate at-risk kids. I think that's the wrong move, and I won't support that if it comes to me, because philosophically I'm opposed to that. I think that students do best in a heterogeneous grouped environment, and that if the environment isn't working for the students, then it's the environment we need to change. We don't need to send students away. It's probably not working for students who aren't at risk. They just are managing to figure out a way to make it work for them. It's the at-risk students who suffer the most at making this traditional organizational environment work to their betterment. But to segregate them and send them off with other students who are at risk.
Can I just stress that this is about the 76 kids on average that do not finish high school with us, so this is not about, sending kids out that would be successful. This is about recapturing students who we are not successful with. Absolutely, we are talking about changing structures and supports in our schools. That's what the Nellie Mae Grant was all about. That's the work that's been going on in this district for a long, long time, and will continue. It's part of proficiency-based learning. It's part of all of the work that we're doing. At the same time, we know that we have 76 kids that we are not reaching, on average.
Right, and so my thinking is more about how are we changing the existing structures to bring them back into that existing structure, not to create a 4th structure that we send them to and tuition them to at a cost. And siphoning them off from our existing
And again, I
the
would
students,
just, I would just remind us that that's what this grant is about. That's what this grant, posits as a basic assumption is that, creating a separate program or school that is, substantially different from what happens in a traditional high school is what this grant is about, and that's what we are organizing to do. So it is, sort of assuming that whether it could physically be located in a Portland Public School building or in Westbrook High School, for that matter. It doesn't, we're all, in this together, but it is not, so physically, it doesn't have to be at, JMG's headquarters. I don't know if they actually have them, but so, where it's going to be is less of an issue than the fact that it is a separate program that kids would go to. And in the end, they would receive a Portland High School or Deering or Casco Bay or Westbrook or South Portland diploma at the end of it.
Without debating it, it may just be that this is something where I'm not sure that it's a direction I would be in favor of seeing the district go. Without seeing the RFP and really understanding what it's going to drive us to do, because this is the part about grants. They hold out money, but if they drive you in a direction philosophically you don't want to go, that money is not a help to the district. The planning and wrestling with it and getting paid to do that, that's fine, but that also does often set up expectations that you're going to follow through on it. Having been around the district long enough, I've seen that, and some of the arguments you just made about this were made about in bringing Casco Bay on, and so the public is going to hear some of what you just said as, my gosh, they need a fourth high school? Wait a minute. And that's at a cost to, again, to the people, these aren't folks who necessarily have kids in school. They're just going, why do we need another program? Why can't the programs we've got work? And I recognize that they don't for every student. I work with these students. In most of my career, I've been working with students who are homeless, dropped out, foster care, low income, at risk. So just some things to raise and to think about.
Great, thank you.
Isabel and then Sarah.
So my question is that we have not only the Casco program, which I think provides a really interesting expeditionary model, but also the Paths program, and I don't really understand what the difference is between your proposed model and the Paths program, where students can have really valuable kind of job experience in the automotive industry or with all the other programs that they have.
Yeah, great question. So the difference is that this would be a fully integrated school where students attend or program and come out with a proficiency-based diploma, as opposed to going to Paths for particular classes or to get those certifications. I think Paths would be a key component and to sort of figure out how that integrates where it makes a lot of sense, but it would be different in that way. The other piece about the vision around this model is that there's some pretty deeply embedded social emotional learning supports that wrap around students as well. So recognizing that, again, to Javier's point, this is the 76 students on average that drop out every year. There are lots of needs, and so the staffing structure ratios and partners that would be involved would be really integrated in terms of both the academic side of things as well as the social emotional learning side of things as well. Yeah.
Sarah.
Malia or Javier, can you explain, or just clarify for me, the board's role in this? At the beginning, you said it was for information only, and the original application, I can't recall whether we voted on the original application. It doesn't sound like we're voting this time on this application, and it is changing a deliverance of education, which I think we are in charge of. And so I'm just a little confused as to what role we play in this, because I don't recall that we approved the first application. Doesn't sound like we're going to approve the second application, but yet it's going to potentially change the deliverance of education in the Portland Public Schools and others. And is this part of the regionalization program too?
yes to that second question.
And to the first
Yes.
question, we are not bringing it to you for a vote because at this point, we are submitting a grant for a planning year. Before we move forward, and there is no financial commitment on the part of the district that is that's being made. This is exploring a programmatic option that is consistent with our goal of improving our graduation rates. And so that is where this is coming from. So this is, think about it as one of the strategic components of helping us to advance our graduation rate goal, which is, our achievement goal. So that's where we are. When we get to the point where we're asking the board to make a commitment to, pay tuition or something equivalent to tuition to send students to a particular site for a particular program, or to, if we run it internally to staff that program, that would be something that would be coming to the board. But at this time, it is not a board vote.
Okay, so the planning, when you're talking about the first year being the planning, time is money, and people are money, and so the people such as Malia and staff, if they're a part of this, are they, salary-wise, et cetera, in their hours, are they collecting that from this planning? Because it's going to take away staff that have other jobs. So I'm curious as to that too, because that is a financial commitment and takes them away from something else. So even though it's a planning phase, we're planning for what? For something that we may or may not approve. So I'm not trying to be...
One thing just to no, I think it's a good point. So one thing just to clarify is that in terms of the funds in the planning year, they would go toward hiring a planner designer. And I think, and Emily, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that per the kind of advice of BAR, they envision that that's at least 40% of somebody's job. And so that is not something we would reallocate from like my time or somebody else's time. That would be a new person and a new set of capacity that's specifically funded through this. Now, of course, obviously, we all need to be connected to it in terms of, some key meetings and conversations, but it would be more like that than sort of the real sort of deep planning focus that is absolutely required and would take quite a bit of capacity to do. Yeah.
Marnie.
So I think this will already be happening, but I'd like to request that as all of these steps move forward, that would be reported out to the curriculum committee, and then we could discuss any moments of, like, for clarification's sake, that would be to report to the board how things are going. I mean, we don't even know if we're going to get this grant yet, of course, but even when and if we do, to have it continually coming through the board to, so that, I mean, this happened again with Nellie Mae. We constantly got updates all along, and we felt more connected to it, and we could explain it to any constituent that needed, wanted to understand it better. That I know you'll do that, but I'm just putting it out there for the public to understand. That's how we can make sure it flows through board work too. Please. Thanks.
Anyone else? Thank you. I would just say that, I think sentiments here tonight have expressed some caution, but I want to express a sentiment that I think, the work is in the right area, certainly is in line with our goals of looking for those areas where we're falling through gaps and addressing those, and certainly our graduation rate is one of those areas. So certainly it's in the planning stages, and we look forward to hearing more about it, but I, for one, think that this is on the right track in addressing the needs of our students.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. That brings us to public comment. It is still before the hour of 10 o'clock, and if there are any members of the public wishing to address us on any items not on this evening's agenda, they may do so at this time. Seeing none, I will close public comment and call for a motion for adjournment. Ms. Davis, seconded by Mr. Atkinson. All those in favor? It's unanimous with the students in the affirmative.